Okay, let's start. Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to this webinar hosted by the Group of 78 on the energy transition. My name is Roy Culpepper. I chair the Group of 78, a progressive forum for dialogue and advocacy on international affairs and Canadian foreign policy. I'm also a member of the Steering Committee of Climate Legacy, a project of the Group of 78, aimed at engaging concerned senior Canadians in climate action. I should like to begin by acknowledging that I'm making these remarks from traditional unsurrendered and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. We honor all First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and Indigenous peoples whose culture and presence continue to nurture this land. Over the past 2 years, Climate Legacy, in collaboration with the Group of 78, have hosted a series of webinars focusing on finance as a key driver of the climate crisis. By investing in the production, distribution, and consumption of fossil fuels, finance is a vital part of the supply chain, resulting in the emission of greenhouse gases that cause global warming. Our webinars spoke to the question of what we could do to arrest this perverse allocation of financial resources. What can we do as individuals through our personal retirement savings and investment funds, or as members and beneficiaries of pension funds, which are significant investors in fossil fuel, or as citizens and taxpayers to demand that our governments stop subsidizing fossil fuel production through the tax system or through various provincial and federal agencies. We believe that this first set of webinars that we've had over the past couple of years illuminate the key causes of the climate crisis and what can be done to help stop it. We urge you, if you missed those webinars, to view them online. Today's webinar on the energy transition initiates a new series co-hosted by Climate Legacy and the Group of 78 on financing the transition to a zero carbon economy, in which we take our analysis to the next level. Next week's webinar, a week today on April the 25th, will focus on greening the financial system. Ending the climate crisis requires not only that we stop the cause of the problem, but also that we effect a transition in the economy to alternative zero-carbon sources of energy and green technology. In this upcoming series of webinars, we shall focus on the question, how will all this be financed? The scale of finance will be huge. If the transition is not financed, we are less likely to relinquish fossil fuels, further exacerbating the climate crisis. Understanding the energy transition is the first step to identifying the role you can play in getting us there. In this first webinar of the new series, we shall learn about what the shift to a zero-carbon economy will look like, including debunking some common myths. This will help us understand the major milestones we need to meet in Canada and get an overview of the different levers that can help us meet our goals. Okay, complex questions await us, and to address these questions, we're extremely fortunate in having the expertise of three distinguished speakers, whom I shall now introduce very briefly. Adam Scott is a climate change expert with extensive domestic and international experience in policy, energy, and finance, as well as in campaign design and execution. He has a lifelong commitment to supporting the transition to a zero-carbon economy in Canada. At Shift, a civil society organization of which he is the director, he works with a number of stakeholders to bring international climate leadership into Canada's financial sector. Nichole Dusyk, one of our two other speakers, is a senior policy advisor for the International Institute for Sustainable Development's energy program, working on the Canadian Energy Transitions team. The focus of her work is providing research and analysis to support a transition away from fossil fuels and towards a more just and sustainable energy. Zachary Repel is a policy analyst with IISD's energy team, working on carbon pricing strategies as well as international just transition implementation. Okay, so Adam is going to lead off by setting the context and by talking about what is meant by the energy transition. Zach and Nichole will follow with the presentation from IISD. Adam will then make some observations before we go to Q&A. So welcome all to this webinar. And Adam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Roy. Just going to share my screen here. I hope everybody can see it okay. And I think it's really important we're having these sort of broader conversations about finance in future webinar conversations, and I'll be part of the next one as well. But this conversation is really important to sort of ground our heads a little bit in the reality of the situation we find ourselves in around the energy transition. So I'm here to set the stage for that. And I'm sure we all hear about energy transitions in our conversations on climate, but it's often really unclear what exactly is meant by energy transition, both at the high level, but also on the ground in our day-to-day lives. Like, what is this transition actually going to look like? So I know this is a group of really high knowledge folks, lifelong learners. So I'm going to assume there's a really high general knowledge of the climate crisis on the Zoom today. I won't go into the science in any depth. I will quote Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who does a really good job of communicating on this, just to summarize the basics of that, which is, it's real. The climate crisis is real. It's us, and it's bad. And I think we're probably all on the same page on that to sort of as a starting point for the conversation. The graphic that I've got up here on the screen, this is a brand new one. This is only released a few weeks back. This is from the latest 6th assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, summary for policymakers. And it's ideal for sort of putting the climate context or crisis into a generational context. And this one really got me in the gut looking at it, because on this picture, you can see my parents. There's a picture of a baby, if you can look really closely, born in 1950. My parents were born in 1951. They're retired now. There's me. I was born in 1982. And there's my son, who was born in 2020, all on this graphic. And you can see that even for me, born in the 80s, I've pretty much lived my entire life in a world that's warmer than the historical average. And you can see where we're going very quickly here if action isn't taken. So really two things to take away from this image, which is we're already locked into a very high degree of warming to date, but our future really depends on the actions we take immediately, and the impacts will be felt generationally. And you can see the difference between moderating that impact immediately and not doing so. So I feel like this is a really useful frame for an intergenerational conversation. As we know, the overwhelming cause of the climate crisis stems largely from the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. That's coal, gas, and oil. And depending on how you do the accounting, fossil fuels are approximately 70% of global emissions. There's lots of different ways to slice and dice that, but the balance of the emissions come from land use changes, emissions from agriculture and deforestation, as well as chemical and industrial processes. But that ultimately means that solving this crisis requires eliminating fossil fuel combustion from our energy systems as quickly as possible, in addition to reversing deforestation and biodiversity loss, changing our agricultural practices, and changing the way our industry operates as well. And as I showed in that first slide, the severity of warming we can expect is based on complicated statistical models based on assumptions about how quickly we bring down global greenhouse gas emissions to zero. And this is a simplified version of some of those assumptions. It comes from the latest International Energy Agency report on net zero emissions. And I want you to focus on that red line in particular, which charts the path required to achieve the goal stated in the Paris Agreement, which is keeping global temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's a goal that is often linked with commitments to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So sometimes that term is sort of interchangeable with Paris Agreement goals. And there are many different interpretations for applying the science, but basically all of the pathways you're going to hear about that are required to achieve climate safety, as we term it, looks like this. Rapid, unprecedented decline in global emissions to zero, followed by additional efforts to remove emissions from the atmosphere after that. So we don't just stop at zero. We actually have to move towards the negative in all of these pathways. It seems easy, right? And this is from the same IEA report. This is probably too much detail to get into in the presentation, but you can look closely and you can see some milestones in the IEA's net zero energy outlook. It's one potential scenario for how we might achieve that net zero target by 2050. And it gives us some helpful examples as for what might be required to stay on track through the transition. So what we might need to see. If you look closely at the top left, you'll see no new oil, gas, coal fields, mines approved from 2021 onward. We're already past that. By 2035, no new internal combustion engine cars sold anywhere. By 2050, most buildings, zero emissions. So you can sort of see there are a number of different global sort of milestones that have to be hit. It's quite aggressive, and it covers sort of all areas of our society in many ways. Now, I wanted to sort of stop and consider the framing of how we think about solving this problem. There's a frame of reducing emissions that comes along with talking about climate. It doesn't really fully capture what needs to be done here. It's a bit overly simplistic, and it sort of fails to grasp the reality of the transition required. So it's not like it's inaccurate, it's just not complete. So we're told you can do your part by making marginal emissions reductions. There are new technologies that will save the day, maybe drive less, maybe put on a sweater if it's cold, those sorts of easy personal actions, swapping one technology for another. And if those were true, we'd be well on our way by now, but we're not. Global emissions have continued to rise. And so it's really important to recognize, I think, that the energy transition isn't just about cutting emissions with the adoption of new technologies. We need a wider frame than that, one that considers people, actual people, and what happens to them through that transition. So that's why we talk about ensuring a just transition for workers, for example. It's about shifting our institutions. So it's not just about government, it's about other areas of our society and how they operate. So at Shift, we work on shifting pension funds, for example, and to make sure that those institutions share the same goals that we do. It's certainly about culture. We can go into a whole side conversation about cultural issues around this transition, but and a good example would be we have a real problem with car culture in North America. It makes it harder for us to fix our transportation and land use problems. We have our personal identities wrapped up in our choice of vehicles. We're very resistant to change, and it's one of the elements that's part of the difficult problem here. So, and the last one I always like to point to is this transition is also hindered by questions around money and corruption and power, and we don't talk about that enough. Fossil fuels are historically one of the most, if not the most profitable industry in history. And our leaders often care more about protecting the interests of this one industry over the public interest, and that's continuing today. So I think this wider frame of corrupting influence of fossil fuels is an important one to keep in mind. There are active forces trying to resist the transition because it will impact their bottom line. So I find it helpful to think about the energy transition more in terms of disentangling a knot. We can't really begin to solve the climate crisis until we loosen up some of those ropes that are bound into a tight little ball there. We haven't actually made very much progress to date because of that. We haven't been trying to address the systemic roots and to actually untangle our society's dependence on fossil fuels. So for me, that's sort of a philosophical view, perhaps, but I find it useful to sort of take a bit of a broader lens on what we're actually thinking about when we talk about transition. And there's one more thing I want to add here, which is a bit of a personal bug of mine, which is cutting emissions to zero is the goal. we actually have to go for zero. We're not trying to just make marginal emissions reductions. That doesn't actually accomplish what we're trying to do here. There are many actions we could take to marginally reduce emissions that have no systemic pathway to zero. And I'll give you the example of buying a brand new efficient gas furnace in 2023. You might save a few percent of emissions by doing that, by having marginally better efficiency, but you've just made a big expensive purchase, and all you've really done is actually lock in more emissions. You could be choosing a zero carbon option instead. And carbon capture and storage for oil and gas production is another example of that sort of snooze button mentality, where you might be able to marginally reduce emissions in the short term, but you could end up delaying the transition in the long term. So there's some bigger questions here around how we frame addressing this problem. And I want to frame this in the context of, let's plan systemically to get to zero and avoid those dead ends. So ultimately, that means the energy transition is about rapid, unprecedented action to eliminate fossil fuels from our society, electrifying our transportation systems, electrifying home heating, converting our electricity generation to zero carbon sources, and phasing down coal, oil, and gas production. And all of this needs to happen within roughly 25 years. And that's quite a statement to think about. And of course, this has major implications for Canada. We're roughly the world's fourth largest oil producer, the sixth largest gas producer. And I'd say Canada has not yet fully grasped the difficulty and the significance of this transition. So on that cheerful note, I will kick this over to Nichole and Zachary, who can help us better understand the specific challenges and actions underway around the transition, both federally and provincially in Canada. We can get a bit more into the weeds and some concrete examples. And I hope that was sort of a useful setting of the stage. Over to you, Nichole, and I'll let you share your screen.
Thanks so much. I'm going to...
Zachary's going to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to start. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Yeah. Thanks for that, Adam. I thought that was really well done. Really important points you're raising. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about our research that we do at the IISD and some things that are relevant here in the discussion. So to start with the global context, so all credible 1.5 degree global warming scenarios see a rapid reduction in oil and gas demand. And basically, what this means is that the word scenarios all major organizations, they put forward these kind of scenarios. If we want to hit 1.5, if we want to hit 2 degrees, and basically they calculate, okay, in the 1.5 scenario, what does this mean? In the 2 degree scenario, what does that mean? And basically, if we want to achieve a reasonable, if we want to win our fight against climate change, it means a massive reduction in the amount of oil and gas that we make. And Canada is a major exporter of fossil fuels. And so because of so much of our oil and gas is exported, prospects and overall health of the sector depend on the emissions reductions. And this is basically, the point is this is going to have very serious implications for the Canadian energy sector. So to move on to...
Zach, do you want to try putting it on a slideshow presentation?
Oh, no, are you... Okay.
If you can.
I've got 2 screens going here, and it has it properly on one, and it has it not properly on the other one.
Okay, never mind. Just proceed.
Okay. Really sorry about that. I'm going to try to get that sorted out at a different point. Yeah, so, sorry about that, everyone.
It's okay. Proceed. It's fine.
Okay. Yeah, so looking at the Canadian context, oil and gas in Canada, all energy future scenarios, including from the International Energy Agency, project a decline in oil demand globally as climate policies intensify. So Canada's own body, even the CER, the Canada Energy Regulator, shows a projected decline in Canadian production. And basically, Canadian producers are vulnerable to 2 foreseeable threats. One is declining global demand for oil, and the other one is falling oil prices. So almost all Canadian exports go to American refineries. This reliance on captive buyers initially shields Canada from the worst of the decline in demand, but it's not a buffer that's going to last. Nothing is going to shield Canada from global oil price drops and also volatility. So basically, the point is this will affect all oil producers, including the Canadian ones. So Canada cannot afford to delay support for diversifying into sectors that can replace oil as our primary energy source. So to look at natural gas specifically, the current energy crisis has changed the story around natural gas. So before the energy crisis, maybe even like a year ago, effectively natural gas was recognized as what was called a transition fuel, and it was common to talk about a significant increase in natural gas demand. But this has changed since the oil crisis, and people aren't talking about natural gas in the same way because of, one, high prices, and also two, the way that natural gas is used as a geopolitical tool, especially by Russia in the context of the Ukrainian invasion. So in major scenarios from, like, for example, in the IEA, natural gas is being downgraded. Costs of renewable energy have gone down so much that it's changing the economic landscape of natural gas. It's far more insecure now, because having high or volatile energy prices, fossil fuel energy prices, means that the prospects for renewables are just so much higher, because the pricing of renewables is a lot more reliable. So we've gone to a place where there was anticipated growth in natural gas, but now this is unclear. We're going now to a place where LNG in Canada might be actually displacing renewable energy. The story for oil is a little bit different. Whereas gas really changed with the energy crisis, for oil, it exacerbated existing trends already. So decline in oil demand is mostly driven by road transportation vehicles, which is the largest component of crude oil demand. Almost half of all oil is used for this. And EVs are changing the oil demand landscape here. Also, new efforts to reduce reliance on oil come from the IRA, like the American climate change legislation, as well as momentum in the EU around the energy crisis. And this is happening faster than we think, just because the scale of clean energy adoption is much faster, is growing faster every year. So heat pumps, for example, are already outselling gas furnaces and boilers in the US and in a growing number of European countries as well. EVs, there's a number of things to consider when it comes to EVs in Canada. Canada does not have a high EV adoption, as high of EV adoption as other countries do, but we are on track to achieving higher adoption rates. High costs are proving to be a challenge, and also this includes supply availability challenges, lack of model availability, and also battery supply chain challenges. When it comes to coal transition, the coal transition is relevant in Canada because it's one of the largest sources of emissions reductions. Comes from moving away from coal. How the coal transition has happened in Canada is that Ontario did it first. They did it on their own, and then after Notlake came into power in Alberta, this kind of it enabled federal regulation that compelled other coal provinces to take similar action. So the main provinces in Canada that use a lot of coal are Saskatchewan, and as well as the Maritime provinces, and they're in the process of slowly transitioning away from coal. And fuel switching towards natural gas has allowed provinces like Alberta to make significant gains towards coal phase out. That's one of the main reasons why phasing out coal is even a possibility. Okay, talking about electrification challenges, there are a number of challenges that we face. Obviously, as we turn away from fossil fuels, we're going to need to very significantly adopt, increase the amount of electricity that we supply. Because Canada's energy system is dominated by oil, gas, and coal, the geopolitics of global producers, and has potentially unpredictable market forces that affect our energy transition. The good news is that cost of renewables has declined to a point where in many markets it's less expensive than gas or coal-fired electricity. Some main issues have to do with high capital costs, that it's just very expensive to set up all the infrastructure required. And also in Canada, one of the main challenges has to do with provincial interconnections, that we have different grids in every province, and interconnecting these grids is massively complicated for institutional and political reasons. Most grids currently run north-south in Canada, and to establish east-west grids would be kind of a new challenge. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about electrifications in Manitoba. So for example, in Manitoba, we have Manitoba Hydro, which is our energy public utility here. We're an example of a province that has 100% clean electricity from 17 hydro dams and 2 wind farms. The other provinces, BC and Quebec, also have mostly hydroelectricity. Across Canada, every province has a unique energy profile, so energy solutions look a little bit differently in every jurisdiction. So in Manitoba, for example, there's no new dams being considered because, one, they have a very high cost. 2, export conditions are changing in Manitoba. The exports aren't quite as reliable anymore. And also they just take a really long time to get going. So Manitoba Hydro, this information comes from Manitoba Hydro. What they call their IRP process, the Integrated Resource Plan. It's basically their energy futures plan, and a lot of this information is public, and they have these public sessions to kind of update people about what they're planning and how they're going to tackle these challenges. The main challenges represented in the graph on the left, you see electricity only provides around 24% of all energy used in Manitoba. This number is pretty consistent across Canada and across the world. So if you think about all the energy that we use, like for anything, driving your car, heating your house, agriculture, or whatever, electricity is only 24%. Most of it comes from fossil fuels. And so the challenge is obviously in Manitoba, how are we going to account for this increase in electricity demand? And they've done studies. If everyone switched to a heat pump in Manitoba, we would need twice as much or potentially 3 times as much electricity, which means and like I said, they're not planning on building another 17 hydro dams. We've done quite a significant amount of damage to the, indigenous economies up north and ecosystems as well. And so one of the things, so really what we need beyond just switching to electric technology, really the main point, a big part of our energy transition we need to shift our thinking in terms of building societies with a reduced energy demand. And that means in a place like Manitoba, it means significant investment in retrofit programs where you build houses that just don't need that much energy. That's basically the only reasonable path we have to reducing emissions, because Manitoba Hydro is actually planning on importing natural gas to start generating more electricity. So we are carbonizing to achieve decarbonization, and which is obviously problematic. And that's mostly what I wanted to say. I'm going to pass it over to Nichole here.
Thanks, Zach. I'm just going to end just talking a little bit about what's happening at the federal level in terms of federal policies. And I just want to acknowledge too that I think both Adam and Zach ended up in the same place in terms of talking about the messiness and the systemic nature of the energy transition. And so we're presenting some pieces here in terms of some of the things that need to happen and what this needs to look like in Canada. But almost by necessity, we are simplifying, in part because when we approach it from a policy perspective, it's hard to approach the whole problem at once. But also, just out of the nature of it, it is very complex, and there's a number of moving pieces. So when we look at what's happening at a federal policy level, I'm actually really excited to see, and I'm glad Adam put up his slide that was talking about policy milestones from the IEA's net zero scenario, because the federal government is currently working on two policies in particular that would lead us towards those two of those milestones. One of those is through ZEV mandates, zero electric vehicle mandates, and particularly the 100% electric passenger and light duty vehicles by 2035. Current government has proposed a mandate that would require that, so we are hopefully on our way towards having a policy in place that will lead us towards that milestone. And similarly, the clean electricity regulation is another piece of policy that's currently underway, and that is oriented towards getting electricity grids in Canada to net zero by 2035. That too is aligned with the IEA's, one of the IEA's milestones for its overall net zero scenario. The other two big pieces, and what I will say too is, the federal government right now is in a place where it's kind of a good moment. We have an ambitious federal environment minister, but there are a lot of important pieces of regulation and policy that are in the works. It's kind of a critical moment because there's commitments being made, but one of the problems we have in Canada is sometimes we end up with big commitments, and then as we implement, they end up weakened along the way. And so a bit of a job to do in terms of making sure that these policies are implemented in a stringent way that actually do take us to those milestones that we've seen from global modeling, and make sure that Canada's energy system is aligned with those. So the really big, the other two policies that are I'm going to highlight today are the emissions cap for the oil and gas sector. So that is important because Canada has made a lot of progress in terms of reducing emissions, particularly around electricity, as was mentioned by Zach, but the elephant in the room is that emissions from the oil and gas sector continue to go up. And when I say emissions from the oil and gas sector, that's emissions from production of oil and gas. We count emissions from combustion of oil and gas under different sectors. So when we talk about oil and gas sector emissions, we're talking about the emissions that come just from producing the oil and gas. Those emissions, as of 2021, represented 28% of Canada's total emissions. So producing oil and gas is the largest source of emissions in Canada, and we do not have a good set of policies in order to reduce emissions within that sector. The larger piece there is obviously we just need to phase down production of oil and gas, but due to complicated dynamics, the piece that the federal government is trying to move on right now is actually just to try to drive down emissions. Obviously, we want to see that production go down as well as seeing the emissions go down, but the emissions cap that's being proposed right now is just focused on emissions. So it's trying to incentivize reducing the emissions that come from oil and gas production. There is an ideological divide there in terms of whether we can actually reduce those emissions enough. As Adam pointed to, I am similarly doubtful that that can happen, that there is a net zero trajectory for that sector as a whole. But current thinking within the federal government is that there is a net zero scenario for that sector, and so we can drive down emissions from production and then have some level of production that is compatible with our net zero goals. That is a more complicated picture to unpiece, but it gives you a little bit of a background around the focus on emissions versus actually just driving down and regulating reduction in production of oil and gas in Canada. Happy to talk more about that after the presentation or in question and answers. And then the final piece that I wanted to point out is what we refer to as just transition legislation. The title of this has switched due to some politics around language, but basically it's being called the Sustainable Jobs legislation. This is the federal government's initial attempt to create a framework around a just transition for fossil fuel workers, but hopefully, and we would hope to see not just for fossil fuel workers and fossil fuel affected communities, but other communities that are affected by the energy transition, such that we can support good and decent work in Canada, and that we don't leave individual communities or Canadians behind, and that the supports are in place to make sure that we have a thriving labor market, an appropriate labor market, and we have good jobs in Canada without fossil fuels. So I will pass it, that's the end of my comments. I'll pass it off to Adam to make a few comments, I think, about bringing it home a little bit more to the more specific everyday issues that we all face.
Okay, thanks, Nichole. Back to Adam.
Yeah, so really helpful sort of fly through. There's a lot of detail in all of those various pieces, but there's policy on the way to make it easier to do some of these things. And I think that's where the systemic and the personal interact. For many years, we've been told, personal action is where we should be focused, but we've had very few tools as individuals to make meaningful personal action. I'm happy to say I think a lot of the tools we have now in 2023 are a lot better. So it is quite possible in this day and age to make a pretty major impact on your own energy use and to contribute to the transition. So I can talk about a few ideas for how personally you might be able to do that, and then we can talk about some of the other systemic issues that we can feed back into. So I will say we're moving into an era where you can electrify your house. You can replace your furnace with a heat pump. You can invest in energy efficiency. These things work. Solar power is very easy to install. All of these are expensive, and the subsidies in place are still fairly small, but they are all very doable. And I'll speak personally. I have now cut my gas connection in my house. It took me some years of planning and a lot of thought, but we have installed an air source heat pump. We are using induction for cooking, and we have a normal water heater, electric water heater. And as a result, we've cut the emissions from our house down to a tiny fraction of what they used to be. So just to say that not all of these are accessible to everybody, depending on your circumstances and if you're renting, or all of these other questions are really important. But there are increasingly more options for individuals to get around using electrified bicycles, or electric vehicles, or these other pieces. So we can talk more about that in a Q&A. I think I'll just leave it there. But to say that there's quite a bit you can do at a personal level that can contribute meaningfully. But to focus back on the systemic change, I think that's something we still really need a lot of citizen action to do. At the political level, we always say vote. That's obviously incredibly important. There are constantly elections that are important. Vote for elected officials who demonstrate a credible commitment to advancing the energy transition. Please be sure to do that. But beyond elections, engagement is incredibly important. And that's often less common for folks to be politically engaged in between elections. And so I strongly encourage you to reach out to your elected officials at all levels and have a conversation about action. And we can put some, or maybe have Climate Legacy send out some links to some potential action tools for that. But there are actions in place from different organizations in support of all of the federal policy actions that Nichole mentioned, for example. There are strong support for ZEV mandates federally, strong support for I'm sorry, I forgot the new name of the just transition legislation, but there's quite a bit of political work to do, and sending strong support for the policy level is incredibly important. And I would say at the community level too, don't discount the community institutions you participate in, your own local community, your local government. It's incredibly important. We find lots of seniors in particular are very active in their communities and are parts of local community boards and other areas, and making sure that community endowments are not invested in fossil fuels. working to bring solutions at the community level to make sure that your community can address this as well. So those are also sort of some quick ideas. And I'm very focused as well on the financial side, so I can talk about that endlessly, but we can save some of that maybe for next week's webinar. But I will say, ensuring your own investment portfolio is invested responsibly and ideally not in fossil fuels. It's a really smart financial decision as well as trying to find opportunities to invest in the solution side of the equation. Is huge growth and opportunity in your own investments there. And that goes for hiring investment managers, making sure that anybody managing investments on your behalf is aligned with your climate goals. If they say that they can't do that, then they're not up to the task. There are many investment managers now who can do that for you. Switching to a bank or a credit union that actually is not contributing to this problem. We just heard last week, RBC is now the single largest fossil fuel finance institution in the world, $46 billion in finance in 1 year. And all of the big five banks rank in the top 25 list, which is appalling. So in spite of them making net zero commitments, they haven't followed that up by changing the way that they lend. And so there are opportunities to switch to credit unions, or if you're on the West Coast, Van Citibank, there are lots of examples of better options that aren't contributing to the problem. And Shift, we really work heavily on engaging your pension fund manager. All Canadians are members of at least one pension plan, federally the Canada Pension Plan, or the Quebec Pension Plan in Quebec, or your own employer pension plan. And engaging with your fund managers is incredibly effective and important. If you go to shiftaction.ca, we have an action tool for any one of the major pensions in Canada, and you can engage your pension fund directly there by sending a letter. Strongly recommend you do that. And as well, we talk about all these sort of other areas in which you might be involved in your community where finance plays a role. So I won't go into any more detail. That's way too much of a summary already, but yeah, we can share some links and some potential actions. But I will say we might want to kick over into sort of the Q&A part of the conversation now. We covered a ton of material across a wide spectrum there far too quickly. So it might be worth diving into some of those questions a bit more and seeing if there's particular interests that the audience has.
Okay, thank you all for your very elucidating comments and suggestions. And I really appreciate, Adam, your concluding on the notes of what people can actually do. So if there are any other such thoughts among any of the panelists, please keep those in mind and introduce them to the discussion. Actually, as a moderator, I'd like to start where Andrew had just left off, talking about RBC as being one of the biggest funders of fossil fuels in the world, if not the biggest. I believe that was the revelation, correct? We've also heard from the recent annual shareholders meeting of RBC that RBC is partnering with Maple Leaf Foods, Loblaw, Nutrien, and other leading companies to create the Canadian Alliance for Net Zero Agriculture, or CANZA. And this is part of RBC's ongoing Climate Action Institute, which is continuing with collaborative efforts with partners in the buildings sector, including working with the Brookfield Sustainable Institute at George Brown College. So I guess the question is, can the big banks, the big financial institutions, convert from being part of the biggest part of the problem to a large part of the solution by transforming their activities and focus and engaging in these kinds of initiatives, such as the ones that RBC has recently launched? Do they have any credence? What do you think?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible for the financial institutions to change. They just don't want to. They are making a lot of their revenue from continued lending into this sector. And so they are sort of, by the textbook definition, greenwashing, and that they've made strong commitments They've joined the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, called GFANZ, led by former Bank of Canada and Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, who originally set up an alliance for financial institutions to make commitments. All of our big five banks committed to it. And one of the key rules that was released in guidance for that group was no new fossil fuel finance. It's a very clear guidance from several international expert bodies that advise financial institutions to say no new fossil finance should occur if you're going to have a net zero policy. Otherwise, it's greenwashing. And that hasn't been the case. But I can point to a number of other large global banks that have actually made that commitment. And the most recent one, which is quite interesting, is HSBC Global, committed to phasing out its finance of fossil fuels internationally. And ironically, they are selling the Canadian part of their business to RBC presently. And in doing so, the branch, the HSBC Canada part of the business, has not adopted the fossil-free pledge that the larger global company has. But I can point to a long list of global financial institutions like banks that have done this, taken this step, and it's been leadership that is very plausible and doable. So the thing I like to say about this is that they will make this commitment. It's just a question of whether or not they're going to drag this out for far too long, causing both climate damage, slowing the energy transition, and putting the financial system itself at risk. So we have to sort of keep pushing, but it's very, very likely that they can do this sooner than they admit that they can.
Thanks, Andrew. Any comments from Nichole or Zach on this issue?
I'll let Adam take all of the banking
Take all the finance questions.
He's the expert in the room on that one.
Okay, Zach? Is Zach still with us?
Yep.
Do you have any comments?
Sorry, I'll let Adam handle those questions. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so we've got a few questions in the queue. The first one's quite political. A conservative federal government would represent a huge setback for the fight against climate change. What is being done to inform the voting public to support a government committed to emissions reduction? Who would like to take that one?
I can take a stab at it. It's going to be a little bit of punting it. Our organization doesn't actually work with the public. We work more on a policy and working to influence policy. And so that's not something that we're actively working towards, but I would actually encourage the folks on this call to start thinking about that, because it is obviously a major issue. Those of us that work in this space worry a lot about that possibility and what that means. I think certainly there is some thinking happening in terms of trying to, say, protect the carbon pricing system. But obviously we're at a point where even if we had a carbon pricing system that was in place but not ratcheted up, that would be completely insufficient. So protecting certain policies is one of the things we can try to do. We can build in safeguards to make sure that they're not rolled back, but it will be entirely insufficient if we were to get a party that was not committed to climate action at the federal level. I think too, we also need to remember the interaction between the provincial governments and the federal government. So of course, if things don't go the way we want, we're supporting multiple levels, and sometimes action needs to shift to other levels of government too. And so, to try and keep an optimistic frame, is that it's important to think about both sides of that and think about directing our actions and thinking longer term about it. But what I will say too is that it's something that I personally think about a lot and worry about. I think we need more people though who are out there and actually actioning that request in terms of getting out there and having a public conversation about what that means. And so we'd encourage, everyone to think about ways that they could do that.
The same question can be posed at the provincial level too, correct? There's an upcoming election in Alberta, and the same issues would surely arise within the provincial context there or anywhere else in Canada. Anyway, shall we proceed with our other questions? The next question is actually for you, Nichole. Would ZEV mandates, electric power mandates, include a requirement for residential and commercial buildings to include EV chargers in the near future? These are sadly lacking at present. Alice?
Yeah, so the requirement for around specific buildings and even within cities either typically falls at a provincial level within building codes or in under control of municipalities, just kind of depending on where you are in Canada. So it isn't something that is strongly like that the federal government has a strong lever for. What they can do is they can provide incentives for it, so they can support the rollout of infrastructure for charging infrastructure in various ways, and they can create model building codes that then can be taken up by other jurisdictions. But it's important to kind of understand where, again, we're working in a complex system here with different responsibilities for different pieces. And so for ensuring charging is in place within communities, that is focused for that. Is best focused at either municipal or provincial levels. And so, yes, the federal government is thinking in conjunction with the sales mandate, and that mandate is focused on the vehicle sales. So it is it's at the point of sale, basically. So it actually isn't a purchase requirement, it's a sales requirement. And so the percentage of sales that have to happen for an individual vehicle manufacturer has to be within that target. But they are seeing transportation more holistically in terms of thinking about other ways to support the rollout of infrastructure, but there are limits to what the federal government can do.
Okay, thanks. The next question is directed at Zach, most clearly. I understand Manitoba needs more electricity. Fossil gas import is one idea, but not great. What is the plan in Manitoba for increasing renewable to meet the increasing demand? Ditto for other provinces. I think, Zach, you've answered this in part in your presentation, but do you have any comments on this particular question?
Yeah, so the main two technologies that are used around the world are solar and wind. Those are like the big two. If you read all the, like, if you read through the IEA, and generally those are like the two most reliable ones. The issue is that they do have drawbacks. Is that, I mean, obviously when the sun's not shining and when the wind's not blowing, then those don't produce. Nuclear energy produces about 90-95% of the time. Wind produces about 40% of the time. Solar panels produce about, at best, 25% of the time. In cloudy countries like Germany, solar panels there produce about around 10% of the time. So the issue is in Manitoba is that when we need electricity the most is in the winter when everyone's pumping up their heaters. But the issue is, so if you have like a graph, and on one hand it's demand, so it's like low in the summer and then it goes high in the winter. And then if solar panels the opposite, where we have a lot in the summer and then not that much in the winter, because when people are getting home from work and turning up their heaters at 4 or 5 p.m., that's when the sun's going down and when solar isn't available. And so those are some of the drawbacks with renewables. Manitoba does have 2 wind farms, and I believe the plan is to increase wind capacity as well. Like in many places, the plan is more solar panels, more wind turbines. But yeah, I guess just the one issue that Manitoba Hydro sees is just the permanence, or I'm not sure exactly what the word would be, is to have the steady, reliable stream is what they're going for. That's why hydro is so effective, because you have the steady, reliable stream of the river, right? And that's why people like natural gas as well for electricity.
Zach, I'm glad in your presentation you raised the environmental issue in connection with damming and building dams in Manitoba's rivers. This has been a source of controversy with Indigenous people from that province. So We tend to think of hydro as clean electricity, but the story doesn't necessarily end there, does it?
Yeah, that's right. It's creating industrial supplies of energy for the population is terrible for the environment. If we're going to do it with fossil fuels, it's brutal for climate change. If we're going to pave over the planet with solar panels, it'll be or nuclear energy, obviously controversial in its own right. I guess, and that's why I tried to include in there, like a lot of the folks needs to be maybe rethinking about how much energy we're actually using.
Mhm. Okay, the next question is from Bessa Whitmore, who asks, what about geothermal? How come we don't hear about that so much? Who'd like to take that one?
I could say a few things about it. Maybe others want to jump in as well, but
Go ahead.
yeah, geothermal is an important future technology, existing technology. There are a couple different kinds of geothermal. So I mentioned heat pumps. In the case of my own home, we put in an air source heat pump. But if you live in a rural area or a place where you have access to a bit more land, I live in downtown Toronto, so there's no space here, but you can actually run your heat pump loop through a ground loop. You can also run a ground loop through a nearby lake or a stream. And there's ways of using heat pump technology, which is essentially the same as what's in the back of your fridge, moving heat from one place to another. At a small scale or a large scale to generate heat. There's a larger sort of deep geothermal technology, which is very different, which is about capturing high temperature heat from actual very high temperature areas of the country. So if you have a deep mine and it's very hot, or you have access to certain areas where there's volcanic activity close to the surface, you can actually capture heat that way. And so geothermal technology has been fully commercialized in places where there's a lot of geothermal heat available. Like if you look at Iceland, the country is largely powered by geothermal heat, both for heating of buildings, but also for electricity generation. So there has been effort in Canada to move that forward. In particular in Alberta, there are a couple of companies eyeing it and looking at it. But it hasn't been brought to commercialization yet in Canada, which is unfortunate, but it is something that could be a solution in some places.
I would just jump in here with a little bit. Yeah, that's all true. Heat pumps are really ground source heat pumps, or I guess what people often refer to as geothermal. It's like an actually amazing technology for very cheap, for a very small amount of electricity. You can heat a place. So especially like, I guess I have a Manitoba bias. The winters so cold here. I know. Well, I guess that would apply to across the prairies as well. Where it's so underutilized. It's actually it's a little bit bewildering. Like we could be building so much. What really needs to happen, and what for example, the Manitoba Climate Action Team, they've done really good research around this, is to do horizontal drilling throughout the city, going block by block, hooking up entire houses. Like this is like, if we're going to actually achieve our climate targets, what it would look like teams of people going block by block, door by door, ripping out gas furnaces and going horizontal drilling, geothermal loops, connecting everyone to them. It's quite expensive to install. To dig out and install the loops does take quite a bit of money. But if you could do it en masse and save a lot of money with these big, giant, comprehensive public programs would be the only way. But yeah, really amazing technology.
Okay, thanks for that exchange of ideas on geothermal. David Reed asks, can anyone address the challenge of worker transition? Historically, people who have lost their jobs due to technological advances have lost well-being by most measures. Any comments on that comment?
I can jump in because I had mentioned the just transition legislation. I mean, in my view, this is the necessary countermeasure to climate policy, is that we have to have economic diversification and we have to have a framework for ensuring that there is good work. Because I think as long as there is a threat to employment and to well-being, there's going to be really strong resistance to climate policy, of course, and I think that's very justified and understandable. People want their livelihoods to disappear regardless of the impact of those livelihoods on the environment or on the climate. So I think that it is essential. Unfortunately, this has gotten quite controversial between the federal government and Alberta right now. But I think that at the heart of it, like if we get down to just like basic principles about providing good work and good opportunities to Canadians, making sure that workers that are in affected parts of the economy where the employment opportunities are decreasing, have appropriate retraining and skills opportunity, and that there's an effort to create industries within existing communities, so you're not looking at having to move out of communities in order to, if you lose your job, that we're creating other job opportunities, other industries within those same communities, so that you're not having to relocate, and huge parts of the population aren't relocating. So there's lots of things to consider there. They go from affected workers, but to also thinking about what are the other social supports that support the economy as a whole. Like, are we investing in the jobs that come from education and from healthcare? Those kinds of jobs support communities regardless of where they are. They also provide employment, they provide good employment, things like that, making sure that we're not losing those parts of the economy as well, because those are parts of the economy that workers can transition into too, and they are really important to the health of the communities. So trying to, look at affected communities, affected workers, but then also thinking broadly about what it means to have functioning communities across Canada, what that requires, the kind of workers that requires, and making sure that we have specific programs, supports, incentives, policies in place in order to get there.
Okay, we've got a number of questions still in the queue. Our panelists have kindly agreed to go over a few minutes, if that's still okay with you. Here's a question on Canada Green Homes Grant. I think the idea of retrofitting has come up in the conversation, especially through Zach. For us, it has been a nightmare to actually go through all the hoops to benefit from this program after replacing the oil heating with heat pump. Despite this unfortunate experience, we prefer continued government oversight on this grant program. But here in Ontario, the management of the grant program is being turned over to Enbridge Gas. Your thoughts? Anyone wants to?
Having gone through it myself, I can speak to it a little bit and paid a bit of attention. Yeah, it's unfortunately a really tricky and bureaucratic process. I can't speak. I think the program design could be better. It could be more streamlined, and the resources available are still a bit small. But I am really grateful for the program, and I'm really glad it exists. The federal Greener Homes Grant, the new heat pump program that they've just unrolled, doesn't require energy audits, so it's a little bit more streamlined. If you're going to do the oil to heat pump direct transition, they've made that a little bit simpler now going forward. I don't know if you've gone through that version of the program. I will say your point about the Ontario grant program going through Enbridge Gas is a really good example of inappropriate fossil fuel entanglement. Enbridge has a direct conflict of interest in trying to ensure that its customers remain customers. A typical heat pump install means pulling out your gas line. We canceled our Enbridge account as a result of our retrofit. It was the goal of our retrofit. But the Enbridge retrofit program that is available here, it adds some additional money available, but it would not have our heat pump be eligible. It would require us to have a gas furnace as well as a heat pump in order to be eligible, which is outrageous. So that's something people should be really wary of, is the gas utilities, which are different in different parts of the country, have a very strong vested interest in maintaining your business and keeping you as part of their customer base. And that's something we have to keep an eye on. I've been advocating to have Enbridge removed from that program in Ontario. And likewise, Fortis and BC's pulling the same moves, trying to find ways of getting between you and your retrofit. So that's something we should pay close attention to.
Okay, one more question, and then I've got one of my own to wind up. The oil and gas industry, John Stone asks, have shifted from denying the reality of climate change to arguing for delay, which we cannot allow if we are to reach the Paris targets. Anyone want to comment on that?
Sure. You go ahead, Nichole.
No, I was just going to say, I agree. Yes, but go ahead. You can add more to that, Adam.
Yeah. I would say the reason why Canada still doesn't have particularly strong or effective federal climate policy is because of the oil and gas industry. I've been working on policy for many years, and every single federal policy that's ever been brought forward by successive governments for a very long period of time has been actively and aggressively opposed or watered down by the oil and gas industry. And that's still occurring with all of the various policies that are currently before government, including the oil and gas emissions cap, all of these other layers. They become politicized, and the amount of lobbying that's occurring right now is unbelievable in opposition to climate policy. So I will say that the reason why we can't have or haven't had effective climate policy to date, and the policies we do have, which are great, have been watered down as a result of that aggressive lobbying as well. There are carve-outs and loopholes which have slowed the transition all the way along. So I think it's underestimated in Canada that we think of this as a technological problem often, where we talk about the technologies available, but the reality is there's a real problem with the influence of the oil and gas industry itself, and it's embedded in our institutions in various ways. So that's one of the many reasons why we're trying to sort of disentangle our institutions from that industry so that we can move forward. We're sort of stuck in many places at the moment. And yeah, it's unconscionable. I don't know how I just don't want to sugarcoat it at all. It's appalling.
Nichole,
Yeah,
you going to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that too. From working at the federal level, and I think this is probably pretty pervasive across Canada, across the general public as well, is there is a lack of a vision of understanding how we could do without the oil and gas industry in Canada. And so my take on what is happening on the federal level, yes, there's a lot of power on display, and a power imbalance for sure, where the oil and gas industry is bringing a lot of resources to the table. But I think that there is also just a mindset, and I see this across a lot of parts of the government, a lot of, and more generally, I would say, it's just, believing that we cannot do without this industry, that the industry is foundational to Canada. And so the only path forward is to decarbonize that industry and make sure that it survives. Now, that's obviously a political political issue as well. It's difficult politically to talk about the decline of a particular industry, especially when it's so regionally focused. But I think until we are able to collectively put forward a vision for understanding what Canada could look like without the oil and gas industry, we are going to continue to be in this place where government officials are going to be responsive to the oil and gas industry because they continue to see it as absolutely vital and absolutely essential, and cannot imagine what our country would look like without it.
Okay, one more question from me and then we'll wrap up. My colleagues and I at Climate Legacy and the Group of 78 have been picking up on some experts sounding the alarm about the ecological and human rights challenges of mining materials we need for green technology, particularly batteries. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts? I'm talking about lithium and cobalt and rare earths and so forth, and not only environmental impacts, but also human rights impacts. A lot of the workers are children and they're exploited and abused and so forth. So we seem to be solving one set of environmental problems only to be creating another set. Do you have any thoughts on this?
If I'd be happy to jump in here. Those are very real and very serious issues. Something that people don't know is that the renewable energy requires massive amounts of mining, like way more mining than actually fossil fuel generation does.
I'm not sure that's true, but
no, that's what the IEA says. So, for example, and the damage of I can't quite remember the numbers, but if you punch in IEA net zero, it talks about that it's just a massive amount more energy. Lithium mining is just as bad for the environment as fracking is. It's pretty devastating stuff. And Canada's mining industry, like in the global south, is also like really devastating in terms of human rights across Latin America. And there are many issues there. I could go into details, but it is something to consider, definitely.
The nuance I would add there is, yes, it's a big consideration. It is, the mining implications of the transition are not even remotely on the scale of the environmental damage caused by fossil fuels. The fossil fuel production industry is a major use of those same minerals and materials. So, for example, oil and gas refining requires cobalt and other metals, and so you're not eliminating the environmental challenges by slowing the transition. So the transition has to occur. It's a major issue to try to make sure that the increase in the supply chain for this is addressed. So there's I think federal policy implications to talk about cleaning up the supply chains. There's no accountability right now for Canadian international corporations who are mining. Big problem with Canadian mining companies in Latin America, as Zach said, and there's no sort of domestic Canadian accountability regime that has any teeth. And as well, in the finance side of the equation as well, there are other checks and balances we can add, so filters that filter out finance for those. One thing I really want to emphasize here, which is some of the what you read about the risks of the shortages or the incredible material demands for the transition are overstated, partly because there's a lot of rapid change happening in supply chains and in the technologies themselves. So for batteries, for example, a lot of producers are now moving towards eliminating cobalt entirely from battery chemistries. There are several different battery chemistries available that do not require the same amount of some of these minerals. Similarly, lithium is incredibly important, but the volume of nickel in an electric vehicle battery is far higher than the volume of lithium. So we have to think about not just the sort of new flashy minerals, but also the ones that we're already mining. So if you're thinking about nickel mining in Ontario or elsewhere, we have to think about those supply chains as well. So all just to say, it's a rapidly evolving space, but I do honestly think some of the concerns about it are a bit overstated because some of these changes are on the way in terms of what actually goes into the supply chain.
Okay, so more room for thought and analysis in this area.
Yeah, can I just jump in too? I think that the mining issue is a really perfect place to think about the difference between clean energy and sustainable energy, and to broaden that conversation. I think sometimes we get a little bit of tunnel vision, and obviously climate impacts are urgent, and we need to move forward, and we can't use sort of the complicatedness and the messiness of the issue to halt our progress. We do need to build clean energy. That needs to happen, and it's not going to be perfect, but I think really important to think about broadening the lens. We have also a biodiversity crisis happening. I think with any kind of development, there are impacts, and we need to be able to think through those, and we need to think through them from an environmental and a social cost, as well as a more typical economic cost as well. So there's a number of factors, but I think when we think about the mining issue, thinking about it from a sustainability lens, how do we know there's going to be new mines. We know some of those mines will be in Canada. That might be an opportunity because we have more control over the mines that happen in Canada versus international mines. So maybe there's an opportunity there in terms of repatriating some of that and insisting that those mines be developed sustainably. But we do need to kind of think beyond the narrow goals of just clean energy and think more broadly about the larger impacts of what we're leading to. Because I think when we're talking about something on the scale of the energy transition, we are talking about massive development of certain things, and we have to try to think through all of the implications of that development and work towards doing that in the most sustainable way possible, but not to the point of paralysis, because that is it is also a delay tactic and a potential for us to stop the needed work that we really do need to get underway.
Okay, any further points by any of our panelists? I think that's a great point at which to wrap up otherwise. Good. So thanks to Adam and Zach and Nichole for your enlightening comments and analysis, and we urge us all to think more broadly and deeply, but not to halt the action. I think that's a way to try and wrap everything together. I think it's also important for people to have things that they can do both as individuals and as part of collectives, such as unions and as citizens and taxpayers. On all fronts, things can be done and must be done and can be done. So those opportunities and possibilities have been brought to us with greater force by our panel today. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to those who participated in our audience. And I'm sorry I didn't get to all of the questions. Some of them are very inviting, but we'll have to wait until next week perhaps and pick it up there when we talk about greening the financial system. And Adam will be back with us at that time. And then a final thank you note, thanks to Mo and Stephanie, the Group of 78's Executive Secretary, and Eric Murphy, who's with Climate Legacy, who's been in the control room, making sure that everything runs smoothly in the webinar. Well, thank you all once again, and take care, everyone. See you next week at the same time.